system is they are the control system for your visceral organs. So somatic nervous system, which is the controlling of the skeletal muscle, we have learned with Dr. Jangunis. And those are under voluntary control. If you want to, raise your hand, and if you want to walk out of the room, and that's you made your conscious decision. But for the autonomic control, oftentimes this is involuntary. I wish I could stop sweating when I'm nervous. I wish I could, calm down and decrease my heart rate sometimes. But this is not really depends on your conscious, your conscious control. However, we do have like meditations that can possibly help us, which is not talked about until we talk about the brain control of your autonomic nervous system. Okay, so there's always exceptions. For example, in the somatic nervous system, the reflex arc is involuntary as well. Okay, so if we compare these two systems, one is voluntary, one is involuntary. Although we do receive sensory information from the internal organs and the glands, that those are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, we only refer to the motor control part of the system as the autonomic nervous system. We don't really talk about the sensory neurons involved in this pathway. Okay, so they are the visceral motor neurons. Visceral means internal organs. So the targeted organs for this system, including cardiac muscles, including smooth muscles that, for example, your blood vessels, including other internal organs like your GI tract, the stomach, and uterus, and different internal organs. They also have targeted glands and adipose tissue. Okay, so there's a variety of different organs that we're targeting in the autonomic nervous system. More differences between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Somatic nervous system originated from the central nervous system, more precisely in the gray matter of your spinal cord. Okay, so that's the place you're going to find the cell body of the motor neuron. And the motor neuron's axon is pretty long. It depends on which region you're going to innervate. It could be a very long axon. Normally, it's a single axon that is going to innervate your skeletal muscles. So that's always excitatory effect. And what is the neurotransmitter release in this system? Does anybody still remember that? Acetylcholine, very good. What kind of receptors involved in it? So nicotinic receptors. This is the binding of the acetylcholine directly opening up the channels, letting the sodium, potassiums to influx and efflux, right? So for the autonomic nervous system, it's different. Okay. So we have not just one motor neurons involved in each control. We have actually two motor neurons. The ones that originate from your central nervous systems is called preganglionic neurons. And the ones that are synapses with the preganglionic cells normally is originated outside of your central nervous system is called postganglionic neurons or postganglionic fibers. Okay, so postganglionic neurons directly innervating those internal organs like smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, glands, and other things. So we have two neurons in series, synapse with each other, and then make a control. Especially the postganglionic fibers, they can excite or inhibit their target organs. Okay, depends on the neurotransmitter they're releasing, depends on the receptors that's involved. So we're going to learn that. So this diagram is kind of summarizing what we have learned, and we can give you a little bit more precise image of how their synapses. So you can see that for the somatic nervous systems, you have those receptors that's coming, and the sensory neurons is located in the dorsal root ganglia, and they're going into the spinal cord synapses with your motor neurons, and the motor neurons leave the ventral root, or called the anterior root, and then innervating the muscle directly. And on the right side of the picture, we're showing the autonomic nervous system, which you still have the sensory neurons that the cell body located in the same dorsal root ganglia, and they are going to make synapses with the motor neurons. Oftentimes is in the lateral horn of this in the spinal cord, and these then coming out and leave from the ventral root just as a somatic nervous system. However, they are going to synapse. Okay, so see these ganglia outside of the central nervous system. Those are the nerve tissue outside of the central nervous system called ganglia, and they're going to make synapses to the second motor neurons in your autonomic nervous system, and then changing the internal organs function. Okay, so you can see that they're making synapses outside. Again, preganglionic neurons originates in central nervous system, and the postganglionic neurons originate in the ganglia. The ganglia, the location of the ganglia could be different from division to division. We were going to see in a second. Okay, we talked about there are two divisions of an autonomic nervous system, and there are the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Some, if you're looking online, sometimes they call it, there's a third division, it's the enteric nervous system, which is precisely controlling your GI tract. We do not consider that in our course, so we're just going to differentiate it into two divisions here. Sympathetic, which is our fight or flight situation, which I just described to you. We all have this similar experience. Dr. Jangunas showed you a movie of these very innocent girls riding a bicycle. You guys remember that one? Okay, so when he was talking about the homeostasis, and he showed you that movie, and that movie should be me playing it today, and but he stole it, and that's showing you how you, after you see the movie, your your heart rate increase, your breathing changes, and all this was a fight or flight, very energetic response that is controlled by your sympathetic division. The parasympathetic division, we all know that if after your final you're going to lying at home, listen to the music, enjoying your hot cocoa, whatever, and that's the time we be able to rest and digest. Those are your parasympathetic tone will greatly enhance, and we are looking forward to that. And so you can see that normally most of our internal organs do receive innervation from both of these divisions, and at no time they will be only controlled by one division. They are always working together. The only difference is the tone will change. Okay, so there's always a basal tone, even for the parasympathetic division, even when during the fight or flight situation. So we have to know that the innervation of the target organ is normally dual innervation, and they always have some basal tone that never was shut down completely. Okay. So we're going to talk about the other anatomic structures of your first sympathetic nervous system. Okay. So the sympathetic nervous system is originated from the cerebral spinal cord between your T1 and L2. Okay, so very close to the thoracic trunk and very to the lumbar region. So very central part of your spinal cord. Okay, so the postganglionic neurons, where they find, okay, where the pre and the post synapses find, they could be found in 3 different regions as we listed here. So the primary places that you find the synapses are called the sympathetic chain ganglia. So we talked about the ganglia before. So what is the sympathetic chain ganglia? Is those ganglia find the chain, a series of ganglia very close to your spinal cord, actually very adjacent to the spinal cord on the 2 sides of your spinal cord. They also could be found in a collateral ganglia. We're going to see that. And the rest of them is found in the adrenal medulla, which is a very specialized and different synapses we're going to talk about today. So let's take a look at the chain ganglia. This is where we find the majority of the postsynaptic neurons, and they have one copy from each side of your spinal cord. So together they have two chains. They are very close to the spinal cord, and after that, the fibers, the neuron fibers of the postganglionic neurons, we're going to innervate your internal organs, especially close to the head and the heart and the lung. Okay, we're not talking too much about the visceral organs that are in the abdominal cavity, and we're going to see that in a second. So this is a sympathetic chain ganglia. Okay. So this chain, as you can see, this is your spinal cord, the big one, and close to it is your sympathetic chain ganglia. You have two copies on each side. Okay. So let's trace the sympathetic preganglionic neurons. So the sympathetic preganglionic neurons, the cell bodies originated in this spinal cord, the gray matter. Okay. So if we trace their axons, first they're coming out from the ventral root, and then they're going to possibly making synapses when they exit that level, the same level, and in the chain ganglia making a synapses with the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so this part is a little bit dry, but I'm going to show you why this is important. Okay, some of these neurons do not make connections, synapses, right at the exit level. They actually will travel through and making connections, maybe ascending or descending, and making connections at a different level, another level in the chain ganglia. Okay, so that means what is that important? So that means that any given region of your preganglionic neurons in your sympathetic nervous system could potentially innervating a variety of different organs. Okay, that is a very unique features found in the sympathetic nervous system, which is mass discharge. Okay, so oftentimes when you fight or flight, a lot of these reactions are happening at the same time. You sweat, your eyes open wide, the pupil opening wider, and you have your breathing heavier, and your skeletal muscles ready to action. So all these could be a very massive discharges coming from the sympathetic nervous system. So there's a lot of divergence happening from one given level of your sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so some of them never synapses in the chain ganglia. Actually, they are going to pass through this chain ganglia without synapse, and then they are going to synapse at a region that in front of your spinal cord. We call it a ganglia called a collateral ganglia. Okay, it's very important. Normally it's surrounding your aorta, that region. It's right in front of your aorta and right in front of your spinal cord. So this is called a collateral ganglia. And the collateral ganglia has one copy and not two, unlike the sympathetic chain ganglia. Okay, so this is showing you the collateral ganglia. And it depends on the places they're going to innervate. There are three divisions. Okay, so there are the celiac division, there are the superior mesentery and the inferior mesentery. So those are the ganglia innervating different portions of your body, more or less. And with the celiac, it's innervating the stomach and the duodenum, which is the first part of your small intestine. And you can also find the superior and the inferior mesentery ganglia innervating the rest of the abdominal and the pelvic cavity organs. Okay, so there's a lot of overlapping between these three divisions, but these are the divisions coming from the collateral ganglia. This is another picture, and repeating what we have seen. And I have included many pictures, and sometimes redundant, just to, if you don't like one particular picture, you can go to the other one. But the most important thing I want to address here is you can see that you have a chain ganglia, sympathetic chain ganglia, right adjacent to your spinal cord. And then you have these collateral ganglia, which innervating the abdominal cavity. Okay. So you may want to ask yourself is where you can find the collateral ganglia and how they're different from the other ganglia we have talked about. And just so you know, I emphasize a lot of things on the differences because this is more for the exam purpose. When during the exam, we oftentimes want you to differentiate the differences between the sympathetic division, parasympathetic division. We want you to differentiate the chain ganglia versus the collateral ganglia. So that's why we focus on the differences a lot today. Okay, the third part, we talk about where you can find the ganglionic synapses is in the adrenal medulla. Okay. So the preganglionic neurons of sympathetic division can skip all we have talked about and then directly innervating adrenal medulla. Okay. And in the adrenal medulla, there's one cell that will actually responding to those sympathetic innervations and then starting to releasing hormones. So that's why we're showing you a blood vessel here. Means these used to be called neurotransmitters in other part of your sympathetic divisions. Now it's called hormones because they're leaving this tissue and going into the blood and have a global effect to the rest of your body, wherever you can find a receptor for that neurotransmitters. Okay. So the cells that is very important in this regard is called chromophore cells. Chromophore cells is some people will consider it a specialized or modified postsynaptic cells. A lot of people say this is this cell stands like neurons and function like neurons. They're responding to the presynaptic innervations and they start releasing neurotransmitters. But in this case, it's going to the blood and function as the endocrine. So this figure is showing you a mouse adrenal medulla, and this red line here we labeled is the synapses from the preganglionic neurons, and we have these green labeled cells here, which is our chromophore cells, and that will be able to releasing mostly epinephrine, and also 20% of norepinephrine into the blood. So this is the summation of our sympathetic division. And we can use in this diagram to study the anatomical structures of the sympathetic division and also see what kind of organs is innervates and from which part of your ganglia. Okay. So the structure of the parasympathetic division is share a lot of similarities, but just as I said, we're going to focus on the differences. Okay, compared to the sympathetic. So parasympathetic also have a preganglionic neurons and a postganglionic neurons. The preganglionic neurons, instead of originated from the middle part of your spinal cord, is actually originated either from the brainstem region or in the sacral region, which is the very bottom region of your spinal cord. Okay, so we labeled it here. See, here is the cranial nerve. We already very familiar with them, right? The cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. What does the 3 do in the parasympathetic innervation? Yes, Jake. So it's a model for eye muscles, but for our parasympathetic purpose is changing the length, the the length of your the eyes, and also changing the pupil size. Okay, so during when we're in the parasympathetic, and what we want is to constrict the pupil. Right? We talked about that when we talked about the ocular model. Okay, so cranial nerve 7 and the cranial nerve 9 both have innervation to your salivary glands, so increase the secretion of saliva in different way. Okay, so different the glands of your salivary glands are innervated by these two divisions. We also have a vagus nerve. We talked about the majority of the fibers that are coming from your brainstem is vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is the one innervating, it's a wandering nerve. So that has a very broad regions of effect, including internal organs and many other regions. Okay, so vagus nerve has a very important function, and oftentimes in the past people call parasympathetic innervation vagus innervation. Finally, we have S2, S3, S4, which is from the sacral region of your spinal cord, and which is innervating your visceral organs in the inferior part of your abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. So this diagram is similar to the diagram we shown before. The reason I want to stress here, okay, is those ganglia. We still have the preganglionic neurons coming from the central nervous system. We also have the postganglionic neurons coming from those ganglia. And those ganglia in the parasympathetic nervous system has a name called either terminal ganglia or peripheral ganglia. Okay, so those are the names for the same thing. So why they call this peripheral ganglia or called terminal ganglia? And this is because of this ganglion different from the sympathetic, which is very close to the spinal cord. It's very close to your the targeted organ. So sometimes it's even on the targeted organ, the wall of it. Okay, so if we take a look at this picture, and I want to draw attention to these fibers coming out from the spinal cord, which is your parasympathetic nerves. And you can see that the preganglionic fibers is labeled as brown, and the postganglionic fibers is labeled as blue. So if you're looking down here in the majority of this diagram, can you see blue at all? Very little, right? So this is actually means they have a very short postganglionic fibers in your parasympathetic division. So preganglionic neurons in this case has very long and myelinated axons, and the postganglionic neurons has very short, oftentimes unmyelinated. And the similar patterns actually can be observed in your sympathetic nervous system as well. So for both divisions, the preganglionic neurons are pretty much myelinated, largely myelinated, and the postganglionic neurons for both divisions, they are unmyelinated. Okay. So we're going to move on to talk about the neurotransmitters and the receptors involved in these two systems, two divisions. And this is probably the focus of today's lecture. And the most confusing part of the autonomic nervous system. So because we're talking about the preganglionic neurons and the postganglionic neurons, and we actually have two sets of neurotransmitters we're going to study for both divisions, and we're going to have two sets of receptors we're going to study for both divisions. And we want to firstly separate them a little bit, then we combine them. Okay. So one thing I want to stress is this autonomic nervous system not just going to use the two neurotransmitter families that I'm including here. They're using substance P, nitric oxide, ATP, and all these neurotransmitters. However, for the simplicity, to simplify the topic a little bit, And we're just going to focus on these two neurotransmitter families. One is called cholinergic, and the other one is adrenergic. Cholinergic neurons. What is a cholinergic neuron? Cholinergic neurons are those neurons who are going to releasing acetylcholine as the neurotransmitters to talk the next neurons. Okay, so the acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter they use to communicate with their next, the relay neuron. And where do you find these neurons? Okay, so basically, both division, all of your preganglionic neurons are cholinergic neurons. And for the parasympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic neurons are also cholinergic neurons. They all use neurotransmitter acetylcholine. However, the receptors can be different, as we're going to see in a second. Okay. Every time we turn on the neurotransmitters, we're going to turn it off. And how are you going to turn off the neurotransmitters? For acetylcholine, you could see the enzyme finding in the clot, which is very important for degrade this acetylcholine. And this enzyme is called acetylcholine esterase. Okay. The other one is by diffusion. So if you diffuse it out of the clot, then of course you're not going to have any function, and you can be carried by the blood and to excrete it out of your body. Okay, on the other side of the PowerPoint is the adrenergic neurons. This is another big family that is important in the autonomic nervous system. And these neurons are releasing neurotransmitters like epinephrine or norepinephrine. Okay. So what kind of neurons are those? Which ones we haven't talked about yet? The postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. Those neurons are all right, sorry about that. So we talk about the chromaffin cells, which is also the modified postganglionic cells in your sympathetic nervous system, and those are also releasing neurotransmitters norepinephrine and epinephrine, as we've seen before. And how they're being turned off, of course, they could be actively transported back into the preganglionic neurons, and in the neuron itself, it either be reused or they be degraded using those enzymes we call the MAO. So MAO you probably learned from Dr. Jangunis when he mentioned about the depression, right? Okay. All right. So they've also if the neurotransmitter is not used, they can be diffused out of the clot and then no longer find an effective in the postganglionic neurons. Okay, so that's the difference between them. Okay, and what are we going to see? The next one is, oops. Okay, this is my, the slides is actually outdated. The one thing you have actually is not outdated. Let me just quickly see. Okay. Let's answer this question. So this drug is actually a pretty commonly prescribed drug to use to treat depression, and but recently it has been come to a conclusion that has a major effect on the autonomic nervous system. Based on what we have learned, since this drug is a MAO inhibitor, what you think will happen in this when you apply these drugs? We will have 1 minute to answer this question. Okay, let's see what the answer is. Okay. You guys surprised me a little bit. Okay, so some of you think it's a sympathetic activation, and some of you think it's a sympathetic inhibition. Okay, you guys have to tell me based on what is the MAO inhibitor will do. Yes. So MAO, if it's an inhibiting enzyme that breaking down your epinephrine or norepinephrine, would you have a more epinephrine or more norepinephrine or less norepinephrine? More. Do you guys all agree more norepinephrine? What is more norepinephrine do? What is found in your autonomic nervous system? Sympathetic or parasympathetic? Sympathetic. Is it the activation of sympathetic? Yes. Okay. Which layer is activating? It's activating the is the releasing by the post-ganglionic neuron or pre-ganglionic neuron? Post-ganglionic neuron. So directly, we're having an effect on your targeted organ. Okay. So if you have a, so we all clear now. When you have an inhibitor for MAO, MAO, you're going to have more norepinephrine, and you're going to activating your sympathetic nervous system. Okay. So I noticed that some of you may be confused by what is inhibitor do. You probably want to break down to a little bit of what kind of effect it directly have, and then what is happening to the neurotransmitter and to the division. I see most of the people made a mistake about when we're talking about the opiates in the exam 3 for a similar reason. So you probably want to, just to help you, maybe write down a little in between steps to help you to answer those questions. Okay, so the correct answer is C, sympathetic activation. All right, let's take a look at the receptors that are involved in the autonomic nervous system. So firstly, is our cholinergic receptors. Okay, cholinergic receptors are the ones who is going to responding to acetylcholine. We have 2 receptors found in our systems for the acetylcholine. One is called nicotinic, and the other one is called muscarinic. We're not going to talk about any breaking down the subtype of those receptors. So only the nicotinic and the muscarinic, that level is good. Okay, nicotinic, as we talked about before, is an inotropic receptor. What does that mean? Basically, when the receptor itself is part of an ion channel. So when you have acetylcholine binding to the receptor, it's going to immediately opening up this channel. In this case, it's a non-specific cation channel. So you have a sodium and a potassium, both could be permeable in this channel. So of course, the potassium wants to go out, the sodium wants to go in, but you have a great effect on the sodium, so the cell is going to depolarize. This is exactly the mechanism we find in the skeletal muscle system. Okay. So the why they named the nicotinic receptor is because not only these receptors responding to acetylcholine, it's also responding to nicotine. Okay. So this is exactly the reason why smoke has a lot of effect to our autonomic nervous system. So I want to just break a little bit here, and I want you to think about what you think the nicotine will affect your autonomic nervous system. What is the smoking will changing to your body? And I wanted to quickly talk to your neighbor and then give me some answers. Based on what we have learned from not just by the anecdotally what you see in your friends or yourself, but also what we have learned in the parasympathetic and sympathetic when the nicotine is used. what acetylcholine nicotinic receptor was used. Okay, I'm kind of restrained by this microphone here, so I won't be able to walk closer to you guys. But I want to see some hands, okay? So the more we can move along, and maybe we have more time for the last lecture, I can give you guys some study tips for the final. So I'd like the class to tell me now what you think how nicotine can affect your autonomic nervous system. In which division? Okay. Someone else. I got to. Anybody? Yes. Parasympathetic activation. Why? Okay, so it's going to acting on the post-ganglionic neurons on the parasympathetic. Very good. So is that going to make sense to you when the nicotine, when people smoke, it's affecting possibly GI tract? Does that make sense? Okay, so just a quick note. So for smoking, and a lot of people, the first response will be increase your heart rate, increase your respiration, but also I'm not a smoker, but what I heard is oftentimes they can also increase your GI motility. So if you really smoke heavily, you can have diarrhea and those related GI problems. Anything else? So we heard about the postsynaptic, post-ganglionic neurons. In the parasympathetic has receptors for them. I'm looking for one more answer, and we are moving on. So can anybody else tell me? Did you have something to say? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So what do you mean preganglion? So he was right. He's also going to affecting the sympathetic nervous system as well, as a lot of effects we've seen, the increase of heart rate, increasing breathing. But what is exactly what those receptors are found? Those receptors are finding the post-ganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, which is responding to the acetylcholine that is releasing by your preganglionic sympathetic neurons. Okay? Make sense? Okay. I know this is a lot of pre, post, and sympathetic, parasympathetic, a lot of things, and especially if the neuron is releasing neurotransmitters, but it has to be the relay cell that is having the receptors to responding to these neurotransmitters. Oftentimes this could be a little bit of confusion. But this should be okay after we make some drawings today. Okay, so antagonist for these neurotransmitters, for these receptors, is including TEA and Curia, which is some toxins you may have heard before when we're talking about the skeletal muscles. Okay, so causing the skeletal muscles paralyze the skeletal muscle. People use in native Indians to hunt deers, and so they put some of those drugs to shoot the arrows to the deers. Okay. So the other one is muscarinic receptors. Okay. So muscarinic receptors are found in a targeted organ of the parasympathetic division, which is responding to the post-ganglionic neurons to releasing acetylcholine in the parasympathetic division. And those receptors, the reason they call them muscarinic receptor is because of it is not just responding to acetylcholine, but also responding to the toxin found in the mushroom. Okay, this is the reason we don't want to eat the wild mushroom is because of this kind of toxins found in it. Okay. So this is responding to the metabotropic. This is a metabotropic receptors. What does the metabotropic mean? It basically means the receptor itself is not ion channel, unlike the inotropic, and the binding of this receptor will causing a G protein, activation a G protein, and the G protein will then breaking down into segments that can activating either a second messaging systems or directly activating channels. Okay, so those are indirect kind of effect to those ion channels, and oftentimes the metabotropic receptors are responding much more slower than the inotropic receptors because of these several steps in between that cost a little bit of time in opening those ion channels. Okay, so antagonist for muscarinic receptors is atropine. And what do you think atropine will do? If you're giving a subject atropine, what do you imagine will happen? Can anybody just, this is, you can guess it. What is the atropine will do? This is a parasympathetic neurons were normally responding to these, in the parasympathetic target organs will normally have the receptors and responding to the parasympathetic innervation. So activation of this receptor normally is a digest and a rest scenario. If you're giving antagonist to it, what you're going to see is probably some sympathetic effect, like a raising heart and increased breathing. Does that make sense? I see a lot of bored faces. So does that make sense? Okay, so just a personal note, when I was in graduate school, I was giving atropine for study purpose. And when you're a graduate student, you're going to do anything for $100. And so that's what they treated me with atropine, and I would never wish I would do that experiments again. And so I basically rested there for a good an hour, and I couldn't drive, and I have my friends to drive me from Queens to Columbia University back to Stony Brook. So that was because of this tone down of your parasympathetic, greatly enhance of your sympathetic, make you really uncomfortable. When you now needed to fight or flight, and you will be forced to increase your sympathetic innervations, that's what happened to you. Okay? So there's several receptors that involved in these adrenergic and receptors. The subtypes, sorry. So there's several subtypes included in the adrenergic receptor. There's an alpha subtype and there's a beta subtype. And this is probably the most confusing part. And I would like to basically give you a little bit of guidelines to how to study it. But if you're still confused after I explain, and you can read a little bit on your book, and that will help you. Okay, your book actually pretty good in this topic. Adrenergic receptors and beta adrenergic, alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, both of them using second messenger system. Okay, so you may have heard or may have not heard of the second messenger system. We decided to introduce it when we're talking about the endocrine system. But basically, second messenger systems is involved with the G protein and activating a series of activation of the enzymes, and will then turn on or turn off some proteins. Okay, so basically, it's not just anatropic; it's metabotropic, and it's involved with the G protein. So we have two different receptors for alpha adrenergic, which is alpha 1 and alpha 2. If we take a look at alpha 1 first, alpha 1 probably is the most dominant receptors in the alpha group. So alpha 1, what you can find is you can find in the smooth muscle. Maybe I just draw here. So it's a smooth muscle. That's including a lot of blood vessels. Okay. This is also found in the sweat glands. That in the palm in your palm, and so. So this is different from the rest of your body. You oftentimes, I don't know if your book say that it's localized sweating. Okay, so basically just the palm and the sole, the bottom of your feet, that is innervated by the alpha-1. You can also find the salivary glands have alpha-1 receptors. So those are those receptors, the organs that you find for the alpha-1 adrenergic receptor. Okay. So how about the alpha-2? Alpha-2 is your book didn't say too detailed about it, but basically you can find it in the pancreas. Pancreas, we have learning lab, is not just the secreting, it's secreting, they have exocrine secretion and endocrine secretion. Both of these secretions will be decreased if you activating your alpha-2 receptors. Okay, so this is inhibiting your pancreas secretion, all kinds of secretion. And you also, alpha-2 is also found in the preganglionic neurons. So it actually decreases your releasing of your norepinephrine, epinephrine, as well as your acetylcholine. Okay, so this is working as a negative feedback. If I'm releasing a lot of these norepinephrines, epinephrines, that will, and once you have those releasing, you want to shut down the release and tell the autonomic nervous system to decrease the releasing. This is actually achieved by alpha-2 receptors. Okay, you have also beta-1 receptors, which is very famous for finding the cardiac muscles. So what does beta-1 do? It's going to increase your heart rate and increase your contractile force. So this is the most important function for beta-1. But beta-1 also, some people will say, is adipose tissue and cause innervating adipose tissue to causing the lipolysis. Okay, so breaking down the fatty acid from the adipose tissue. Okay, beta-2. What does beta-2 do? Okay, beta-2 is working on the smooth muscle again, but instead it has a relaxation function. So this is finding your airway. So if your beta-2 is activated, you're going to open up your airway. You're going to relax some of the blood vessels. Okay, so dilating the blood vessels. Those are the beta-2 will do. So then beta-3 is also the adipose tissue. Especially people talking about it's important in the thermogenesis and in the brown fatty tissue. Okay. All right. So this is a very brief. So what is the alpha-1 mostly activated by? It's mostly activated by norepinephrine. Okay. So a little bit of epinephrine also have some effect. Similarly to, this is the E, and the epinephrine, I put it smaller than the other ones. So beta-1, which has a similar effect from epinephrine and norepinephrine. Beta-2 is different. Beta-2 only responding to epinephrine, is not responding to norepinephrine. Okay, so the beta-3 is norepinephrine. Okay. So I'm also going to give you a little bit of second messenger systems, and just for understanding the underlying mechanisms. This is through a system called the phospholipase C. Okay. We're going to learn all the details in the next lecture, so I'm not going to give you the details. Basically, it's activating the smooth muscles. And this is, alpha 2 is inhibiting cyclin AMP. So that's causing a lot of, decrease in releasing neurotransmitters, decrease releasing in those pancreas secretions, okay? So beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, all through cyclin AMP. Okay, they're also going to increase the cyclin AMP level. So this is a different cyclin AMP pathway have a different effect. That's why you see the different effects here. But this is basically all you need to know for these adrenergic receptor subtypes. Okay, so it's just this figure. I'm not going to quiz you anything other than those what we have said here. So what you need to know is targeted organs, what their primary function, and what they are responded to primary to what kind of neurotransmitters, and just to give me the idea what are the second messenger systems they are involved, and hopefully by tomorrow I can convince you why they are important. Okay, yes? Phospholipase C. Okay, so this is what we have learned for this slides. Okay, and I'm going to move on. After we studied the different type of these adrenergic receptors, so let's take a quick look at how adrenergic receptors, the neurotransmitters, the life cycle is. Okay, so unlike your the neuromuscular junctions, you have a very defined regions when you have a releasing of the neurotransmitters and where you have the receptors. And in the autonomic nervous system, in the sympathetic nervous systems, and you can find it is because of the receptors throughout the tissue, you find this very specialized nerve ending. We call it the varicosity, which is a series of swallowing of these nerve endings that will be able to release the neurotransmitters and diffuse throughout the tissue and activating the tissue. Okay, so this swallowing part is called the varicosity. So I'm just quickly label this one here. This is a one varicosity, and you can actually see many of them in the nerve ending of the sympathetic division, close to your target tissue. And we mentioned that the neurotransmitters releasing here, we mentioned they can be actively transported back using the active transporters. Once they go into back, you can be either reused or you could be degraded through your enzymes MAO, okay? And the rest of them can be diffused away and enter into the blood and removed from your body eventually. And that's what the life cycle of your norepinephrine is, okay? So here is the summary of the neurotransmitters involved in the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. And I'm going to see if I can have time to go back to here, but I doubt it. This is the figure I highly recommended you to reproduce on your own. And so you will be able to see the different lengths of your sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And you can see the length differences. You can see the receptor differences, okay? And this is all nicotinic receptors for expressed on the postganglionic cells. Doesn't matter which division it's from. And you can see there's also receptor differences at the tissue level. So they have muscarinic acetylcholine receptors for your parasympathetic. This is your parasympathetic. And you also have your norepinephrine or epinephrine that is responding to the sympathetic nervous system. I do want you to know there are exceptions, okay? So for example, sweating. We mentioned about the localized sweating, which is through alpha-1. Another one I want to mention is the body global sweating is actually through your muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. Okay, so that is an exception in the sympathetic nervous system. You're actually releasing acetylcholine and using acetylcholine as a neurotransmitters to talk, and you find them and to activating the sweat glands. And the receptor you find is the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. Okay, so this is for sweat. This is the only difference. Only exception.